All right, guys, welcome back to the book reading. I have a cat on my book, so I cannot read with the cat on my book. Turn on this light here. All right, so here we are in the book reading station. We got this White City book that we did last time, Spectacle in the White City, Chicago, 1893 World's Fair. Let's continue on our journey. All right, let me know if you can hear me well and all this stuff, although I can't really see comments on my phone. All right, here we go. We're on page xiii. We can speculate with some confidence, however, Burnham's engagement with the Eastern architectural establishment was a source of frustration to many of his Western colleagues, but it also provided a network of information from which he might make his plans. In the case of Arnold, it seems likely that he arrived in the city to test the wind and waters. In that visit made just weeks after the city was chosen. Sometime soon thereafter, he and Burnham met and made their first agreements. Arnold would photograph the construction of the fair and would be well paid for it. In return, he would work immensely hard, under often extraordinarily difficult circumstances, to make lucid, powerful correlatives of the fair's emerging features, rendering its roughness in the best of lights, disguising its haste and often frustrating disorder. Burnham's supporters would provide him with all he needed to make the most spectacular images: cameras, plates, facilities for processing, assistance. Burnham himself would ensure that Arnold had complete access to all aspects of the construction process and would trust him to do with this what the architect and his community most needed. With these resources, Arnold would make an encyclopedic array of pictures describing the process of modern construction of a new city from scratch, in pictures not simply evidentiary, but compelling, inspiring. Arnold began the formal process as soon as there was something upon which to train his cameras. And here we return to the paradox of photography in the context of this hyperbolic exercise in urban design and architectural monumentality. For while they might carry the fair into posterity and greatly increase its influence, still Arnold's photographs depended upon the buildings and the spaces, the sites and exhibits, walkways, waterways, and spectacular features of the environment itself in order to come into being. Arnold was a documentarian. Arnold was simultaneously a rhetorician, even a trickster. That's interesting. His responsibility lay not simply with depicting, but with transforming the sites and its elements, especially at the beginning of the construction phase, when so much of the place was mud and chaos. That's interesting too, mud. How much of the place was mud and chaos. To look at the early pictures is to see just how brilliantly and how diffidently Arnold did that job. Early panoramas of the largely featureless site gave evidence of the scale of the endeavor. They were conceived to serve as part of a far larger narrative. They would stand in contradistinction to the manicured settings rectilinear order and monumental grandeur of the finished product. Pictures of the buildings in early stages of construction showed the technologically advanced and structurally innovative bones of buildings that would, at their culmination, show none of that, having hidden it under the cladding of brilliant white staff that gave the exposition its sobriquet as the White City. Workers perched upon the products of their labor with dignity, pride, a sense of gravitas. The pictures seemed to declare, these are not the malcontents and unionists and anarchists threatening the city outside. See, in the utopian city of the future, even the savages within our borders will be tamed. I don't know if that was like the italic part. But here we have a picture, one of the first pictures. Structure photo, it says CD Arnold 276, First Arches. Manufacturer's Building, April 15th, 1892. Courtesy of Ryerson and Burnham Libraries of the Art Institute of Chicago. So you see steel framing. And I don't know if these are people up there. Does that look like people? It does look like people up there. When you look at it, it looks almost like placed there, you know? But moving forward, let's check out this. Here's another picture. All right. It says C.D. Arnold on the roof of the Women's Building, November 11th, 1891. Let's take a look at this. Much that was dramatic and significant about the construction process was carefully excised from Arnold's composite. So much that was dramatic and significant about the construction process was carefully excised from Arnold's composite. The collapse of roofs, the horror of mud. The horror of mud, they keep bringing up mud. Mud. The sheer quantity of trash and construction detritus that so maddened landscapist Frederick Law Olmsted did not appear in his photographs, or if they did, they seemed transformed by the gorgeous rendering Arnold gave them. So look at this. There was horror of mud, there was collapsing of roofs, and there was a huge quantity of trash. Arnold was a consummate craftsman, and with an effectively unlimited equipment and supplies budget, he responded with work that still glistens, still evokes admiration. His cameras were very, very large, in order that the final images be equally as large, while some were experimenting with the use of new forms of printing enlargers that could blow up a smaller negative into a larger print. Arnold stuck to the more established practice of contact printing, which meant that a large print required a large negative. Mainly, he worked with an 18 by 22 inch negative, made with a so-called mammoth plate camera that was common enough for landscape views, but much rarer for architectural and urban views. Mammoth plate cameras were extremely heavy. Their brass barrel lenses might weigh 10 pounds alone, and their long focal length meant that getting maximum sharpness near to far and edge to edge required long exposures, during which time movement of people and of plants were anathema. The slightest gust of wind at the end of a 4-minute exposure might destroy the entire effect, requiring that the photographer start all over again. Weather was an impediment. Too cold and condensation formed on the lens, or the dry plate negative might lose its sensitivity to light. Too hot and the plate's coating might soften or its chemical stability be impinged. And Arnold was working year-round, making what some have estimated to be an average of 3 or more views a day, every day for the entire duration of construction and exhibition. The subject itself was bedeviling. Anyone who has worked with a view camera on architectural subjects knows the difficulties of ensuring that the right angles of the building transfer into right angles in the picture. To avoid foreshadowing and barrel effects, Arnold had to apply complex tilts and swings of the lens board and the plate back. These were far harder as the cameras grew larger and the lenses more recalcitrant. No wonder so few mammoth plate photographs of cities and their architecture were made. But Arnold made them, sometimes in multiple plates, to be appended to each other so as to form long, slender panoramas of as much as 66 inches. More often, though, he used the panorama as an opportunity to work with smaller and more manageable cameras, while still producing large-scale results. Large-scale in order to render with persuasiveness a sense of the enormity of the enterprise itself, the monumentality of the buildings, the depths of the spaces, tamed and ordered. These construction photographs, made under the aegis of now Director of Works Daniel Burnham, weren't raw evidentiary images as we've seen. The prints were made in platino type, a particularly delicate and demanding process that resulted in delicate, evanescent plates, rich in detail, yet characterized by a quality of light-struck imminence far different than the rich albumen prints of an earlier era, or the mass production images of a future generation. Because they were made by contact, their scale was an effort not of printing technology, but of two moments, long previous, when the camera had been set before the subject and the mechanical activities known as photographic or making the view took place. The photographer had, at those earlier moments, chosen the subject in the abstract, or had it chosen for him by the expectations or even directives of clients. This was often what the caption tells us, a bit of machinery haul. Or roof of women's building under construction, to choose two of Arnold's most enticing and important construction pictures. Okay, so these are the construction photos that we just saw, which I'll go back to after this page. Or maybe I'll go back to it now. So the client asked and titled it to choose two of Arnold's most enticing and important construction photos. These are the most important construction photos. And in my opinion, these don't look super important. Like, you don't see a full range here. This is just like a part of a roof of a building. If we're going to be critical here. Which I don't really want to be objective, but whatever, we're all kind of objective to our opinions. And then this one, so these two are his most important construction photos. So that's not convincing to me. There's a wooden shit shack, and then there's an iron building, which, it looks like The people could have just been plopped there easily in Photoshop, if I'm going to be critical. You know, I mean, in my opinion, convincing construction photos would be like the whole city, like the famous shot that's on the cover of this book. But anyway, let's continue reading. Arnold would map out, armed with such a list, Arnold would map out the work of a day, a week, a season, because the goal was to show the transformation from start to finish. A picture made once from a particular vantage point, with a particular camera and lens combination, would be made again and again, a sort of time-lapse photography spread over months and even years. With such a series in hand, it was argued, architects might later reconstitute the building process to mimic it in another setting, or to learn from it ways to improve the rapid building process. I would like to see some more of those. If the pictures spread across time, they also spread across space. Arnold made pictures of all the principal buildings by the major architects, that is, those clustered around the lagoon and the Court of Honor, but he also was responsible to Olmsted's site work and to the demands of architects and exhibitors who filtered their requests for views through Burnham or through Director General Davis. To have a building or an exhibit included within the overall survey was to ensure its permanence by making it a necessary part of the catalogue raison. But the subject alone was nothing. Only a fool or a client might make such a mistake. Arnold knew that the real work lay in making photographs that transcended their role as mere documentation, without denying the requirement that they provide the maximum of information, both mundane and grandiose. This required solving problems that were both pragmatic and professional, to use a medium that sliced up time and flattened space as a means of rendering architecture, urban planning, and landscape design, all of them fields that exploited the flow of time and the modulating, controlling, and closing and ordering of space. The time-lapse method might record pieces of a building's construction, but it couldn't record the feeling of moving through the space, the sheer length of time it took, for example, to walk from one end of Machinery Hall to the other. Nor could it record the three-dimensional qualities of looking at the vast spaces and their architectural organization. At least not by replication. Arnold knew that photography could suggest these things, could invite a viewer to imagine the scale of the building, and from that sense measure out the time and effort of walking it. Time and again, Arnold's pictures include a figure or a small selection of figures who set the scale of the building and, by comparison of a near-ground figure to one far in the background, to define the deep distances enclosed. In this regard, Arnold was more akin to a landscape photographer than an architectural specialist. He used the techniques of the masters of his time, like William Henry Jackson and William Rao, to give the sense of space and time to pictures. The result was a collection of views that made its patrons proud, without at the same time drawing attention to themselves as pictures. This is a paradox, that images so gorgeous, so delicate, so precious, could also be so transparent. But that was Arnold's brief. He made the very qualities of the pictures seem instead qualities of the buildings and spaces themselves. One of the oddities of the White City is that it was so universally conceived. Before, during, and after its life, as a dazzlingly monochromatic collection of white, where there was shade and color everywhere. The decision of the principal architects, enforced by Burnham, to have white the dominant color of the fair applied almost entirely to the central axis around the lagoon and the Court of Honor. the big buildings in their ceremonial places outside that area, where national and state buildings were arrayed, where specific concessions were placed, and beyond that, where the midway offered a polyglot and polychromatic circus of dazzling thrills. White disappeared beneath a palette ranging from the somber browns of the Wisconsin State Building to the brilliant hues of the ethnographic exhibits. Even in the central ceremonial spaces, white dominated in part in order to accentuate the places where color was used, not just Sullivan's Transportation Building with its golden doorway and brilliantly polychromed surfaces, not just the gilt statue of the Republic that stood high in the center of the basin. Throughout the fair's official buildings, gold leaf bronzing and painted decoration was set off from the whiteness of the larger program. But none of that appeared in Arnold's photographs. They were monochromatic. Moreover, the platinum prints were particularly adept at rendering shades just below the brilliant white of the paper's surface. Arnold exploited this throughout his commission and especially in the official views of the finished exposition, most of which he made in the earliest days of the fair's opening. Once the construction detritus, sorry guys, I'm not the best reader, detritus, trash, temporary rail lines, crates of exhibit materials awaiting installation, and the like were finally removed. That is, his pictures of the exposition are played so very high in the key of white that buildings nearly vanish in the haze of brilliant sunlight that seems eternally to fill the skies above. The White City, then, was as much a product of Arnold's photographs as it was of the architect-designer's decision, because so many critics and writers composed their paeans to the exposition from a distance. They were profoundly dependent upon Arnold's views for a sense of what they were praising, and because most of the guidebooks, catalogs, pamphlets, and advertisements were written in the months before the fair was completed to ensure a competitive place in the sales glut, the writers and publishers referred to Arnold's near-finished construction views for hints as to the completed ensemble. Journalists, too, wrote their first entries in that in-between moment. After the official dedication of the fair in October of 1892, and the actual opening of the fair on May 1st, 1893, in order to have them published during the first weeks of the exposition. Looking at the pictures, they saw a dazzling city of light, and so that was the city they described. Arnold's pictures, then, defined the visual experience for those who came to the fair by providing them directly or indirectly with the cues as to what to see and how to see it. Primed to envision its scale as sublime and celestial, visitors dutifully described it as such, though they could more easily have experienced the fair as an exhausting, sprawling, overscaled sight, difficult to decipher, difficult to maneuver through, difficult to assemble and recollect when they were done. And while many visitors included mention of the demands on feet and legs, the challenges of deciding what to see, having done so, where to find what they sought, most of these comments served as sidebars to the dominant themes of awe, inspiration, and homage. Arnold's pictures primed visitors. They also served to remind them of their experience long afterward. As official photographer of the construction process, Arnold had a near monopoly on the production of the images. All right, let's get this image in here. Of the images that preface the experience. As holder of a monopoly concession on views, stereographs, and portraits accepted during the fair's public run, Arnold controlled the flow of images that visitors bought to take home as well. His photography department offered almost any form of picture, from small cabinet albumins, those 5 by 7 inch pictures on everyday photographic paper, mounted on board with text on the verso, to the mammoth plate plentotypes that also went out under the official seal of the fair to emissaries and dignitaries, to nations and corporations, sponsoring, exhibiting, or gracing the exposition with their presence. Visitors could also buy a variety of reproduction quality portfolios in which information and observation were combined, views with explanatory texts, many of them pre-packaged in segments, so that a visitor could build a custom package and have it bound together and even placed between leather covers. Some of these were gravure portfolios. This high-quality reproduction process, using multiple printers' plates and carefully quality control, could approximate the quality of the platinum prints, not least when they reproduced the shimmering whites and light grays of the originals. More commonly, though, the portfolios were made in halftone reproduction, a relatively new process that enabled inexpensive, high-speed printing of images that, while markedly inferior in quality, were also far more affordable. It was in this guise that many who did not see the fair in person learned of its wonders. Traveling salesmen by the thousands fanned out over the continent selling these sets, often by subscription, meaning that one received a set of pictures with text on a monthly basis and was billed accordingly. Before I get to this next page, we got a picture here. CD Arnold 404, the manufacturer's building. All right, I think this other one was the manufacturer's building too. Yep, it says this is the first arches of the manufacturer's building, 1892. And now here is also 1892. That was April 15th, now this is August 11th. Take a look at that. What are your thoughts on that? Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Wood and Nichols' recent video was pretty convincing. And really showed, us researchers, we can't just, we can't even trust the alternative research. We have to go in and use discernment ourselves, and, and use basic research too, like really go into it. That's kind of why I'm reading this book, because I want to really understand what is the historical narrative on this, because this is kind of the basis of a lot of the old world stuff, the World's Fair. All right, let's continue. We're almost done with this chapter, are we? No. A few more pages. This other market in images is significant, for again, it was here that Arnold's imagery trumpeted and sometimes trumped the actuality. While a general estimate is that 14 million actually attended the World's Columbian Exposition, many more saw the reproductions, some when their families or friends returned with their treasures, some when they purchased by subscription or saw their neighbors' sets, and some when they viewed the fair in the articles and portfolios that appeared in nearly every magazine, journal, and newspaper during the duration, and for many months, even years after. Many of these were not direct derivatives of Arnold's original own work. In battle after battle, Arnold was attacked for limiting access to the fair by photojournalists working for the media outlets and by competing photographers seeking to exploit the demand for views. Arnold was consistently backed by Burnham in his resistance to these demands, and just as consistently opposed by Director General Davis, whose conflicts with Burnham and the planning team were legendary. And it's not hard to see why. Arnold was a devoted servant to the overarching ideology, the style, and the utopian vision that undergirded the artistic elite who designed the fair and oversaw its completion and its continuation. By contrast, many of the photographers and journalists who did gain access produced work that trivialized the exposition or simply devalued it by their very ineptitude. One exception was the landscape photographer William Henry Jackson, who at fair's closing was brought in to produce a final portfolio, probably at the instance of Director General Davis, and over the objections of Arnold. The resulting set of final views, however, almost unerringly followed the program and the outlines of Arnold's own work. When Jackson reproduced his set for subscription series for illustrated portfolios and the like, in the months after the closing, the pictures so seamlessly fit within the earlier work by Arnold that for generations architectural historians and others assumed the work was Arnold's. So it's got a little post note here. This does not include the amateur photographers who fought the department's often exorbitant fees and punishing prohibitions to make their own views. These pictures were often wildly different, exuberant, sometimes inept, casual snapshots made with the newly popular Kodak hand cameras, and they recorded a very different sense of the fair as an experience marked by crowds, by strangeness, exoticism, by spectacle of a very different sort than the grand spectacle afforded by the official views. All right, so I want to take a note of this and look at those, because Arnold was the main photographer who had a monopoly, but if I check this, maybe we can see some other things. Remarkably, the inferior and trivial views languished, while Arnold's views and those that followed his lead dominated the market in souvenirs and in published accounts. What could not be replicated, however, was the visual opulence contained within the huge planktotypes that comprised the official portfolios made by Arnold. At the behest of the exposition's officials for the grand and great who contributed to the fair, whether in money or influence, not many of these full portfolios were made, but they provide a graphic proof of the ideologies that undergirded the exposition. When Daniel Burnham commissioned Jules Waring to make the illustrations for the plan of Chicago of 1909, he expected images that conformed to and yet extended by the exaggerations possible in a non-photographic process. Arnold's photographic portfolio. When cities like San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Cleveland commissioned Burnham's firm to develop city beautiful plans for their ceremonial spaces, they did so under the influence of these platinum prints, many of which Burnham himself collected and used to demonstrate the power of a symphonically conceived urbanism on a grand scale. Arnold himself went on to work with a number of the principal architects. He also carried his talents to other, if lesser, expositions and fairs, notably the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta in 1895 and the Pan American Exposition of 1901. His greater influence, however, lay outside his own career, in the expansion of the City Beautiful movement and its powerful impetus toward the visual sphere, toward making cities as vistas with clearly delineated vantage points from which the city might unfold as a panorama before the awestruck eye of the beholder, visitor or citizen. Today we use his pictures to delineate the exposition, to assemble its central components, to reclaim its history, but also to immerse ourselves again in its particular qualities, the ones so many visitors reported and responded to, its overarching sense of urban utopianism, clad in the reassuring and stabilizing symbols of a long history of civilizations now come to bear on America. Arnold's view was not the only one that held sway at the fair, to his dismay and that of his sponsors. There was also a visual tradition developing well outside the stability, monumentality, and sobriety of the grand style of photography and the urban planning that the White City was meant to embody. This was the photography of amateurs, working ebulliently and unsystematically, making pictures that recorded the minute-by-minute activities of visitors to the exposition. Because Arnold's monopoly was so strictly enforced within the formal grounds of the White City, the official site at Jackson Park, these pictures tended to focus on the peripheral sites of state buildings, even more so on the Midway Placidence. So it's a star here. The best source on the broad range of photographs exhibited at the fair and those made outside the legitimacy of Arnold's monopolies is Julie K. Brown. All right, make a note of that. There, a counter vision to the utopian monumentality of the White City had emerged, yet one equally potent in its proposals for what a city of the 20th century might look like. The White City was almost universally white by race as well as architectural program. The Midway was equivalently colored, to use a word coming into play at the time. Here's this, where this star is. The most direct and compelling indictment of the exposition's racism was published as a lengthy pamphlet by a group of African American luminaries: Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, Irving Garland, Ferdinand Bartlett. While it was executed as a stinging rebuke that was hoped to change the fair itself, it languished. I gotta check out that book too. There, the city was a spectacle of exoticism, of motion, of excitement, and sometimes of danger, imagined or real. Scary natives of foreign cultures, but also pickpockets and criminals. There, more than in Jackson Park, visitors saw the compression of the world into barely manageable dramas and tableaux, from the delights of belly dancers to the sullen stars of the natives of Dahomey, where the fair proper promised to include everything thought or produced, arranged in systematic order within the boundaries of buildings vast enough to house all the products of human agriculture, all the manufactured goods, all the arts. The Midway promised to give you the feel of a global tourist, but at a price in cash and time that a middle class or even working class American could shoulder. While it was a site of imperialism and triumphalism, as much as was the White City, the Midway was also far more the site of democratic upheaval, where citizen visitors and opportunistic capitalists mingled in a marketplace of ideas, dramas, and goods that swirled and changed moment by moment. Midway Airport in Chicago. I think it's named similar to this. This was a landscape appropriate to the snapshot of the Kodak and the street shooting sensibility it presaged. These were views made by their consumers, taken home and shown around with comments or captions their makers controlled. It was a visual opposite to the orderly grandeur of the official views, just as its underlying vision was a counter to the top-down elitism that dominated the White City's inception, execution, and influence. This is not to say that the Midway and its photographs were the province of the people, and the White City the private estate of the elite. Indeed, the rich and privileged may have shunned the Midway publicly, but they swarmed to it in private, taking in its shameless delights with as much a mixture of shock and titillation as one might expect. So also with the White City and its effect on everyday citizens, from the farmers of Ohio to the ranchers of Colorado and the immigrant workers from New York or Chicago or the other major industrial urban centers. These visitors came to see the White City and they adored it. It offered them something of the biblical paradise, something of the school book primer Roman and Greek civilization, and something not known or imagined before. They sought its order and its awe, its soothing expanses of lawn and its dazzling facades of neoclassical ornament, as contrasts with their own experiences of the urban crisis of their time. Together, however, the White City and the Midway offered a more accurate picture of the American city of the future than did either alone. Burnham and his colleagues and supporters, with Arnold as a major publicist and promulgator, profoundly influenced the development of cities in the 20th century, not just in America, but around the globe, around the plain. At that time, the Midway's pleasurable chaos and the untidy, ingratiating, excitable pictures of the Kodak offered a counterfoil in which the inability of the City Beautiful movement to fully redevelop and recast the city could be seen not as failure but as necessary counterpoint. Dangerous at times difficult to decipher or traverse, yet offering environs that could be celebrated and owned, if only by sight and delight by individuals, not just at this moment, but over a long sweep of time. The White City may have offered order and stability, but the Midway and its descendants in the bustling streets of downtowns across the globe offered opportunities to refine and transform the promise of cities to be lived in, made and remade, occupied and owned, and then lost again to another generation, another set of imperatives, another wave of immigrants, tourists, and critics. Just today in Chicago, the downtown teems with both traditions. On Michigan Avenue, a new park abuts the Art Institute of Chicago, built in the part to house the World's Columbian Congresses of 1892 and 1893, and to show the world that the city could live up to the standards of the exposition. Millennium Park, as it's officially named, is a direct inheritor of the White City's imperatives. It was designed and built by an urban elite, delineated by the names of sponsors, corporate and individual, mixing Olmsted-esque landscape forms with the ceremonial sobriety of Burnham. Yet Millennium Park is also a festival place, with children splashing in its public fountains and tourists staring at the games of speed chess or the antics of acrobats or jugglers. Like the exposition, Millennium Park keeps its street spectacles out at the edges, while its corporate celebrations are focused at the center, policed by a 21st century version of the Columbian Guards, now on segways instead of horseback. The segways are so stupid. Across the street to the west, Michigan Avenue's monuments of the city beautiful line the street from Randolph Street, where the city built its monumental public library, inspired by the exposition. Past Orchestra Hall, built again in the post-exposition zeal to remake the city proper. Past Columbia College Chicago, a university founded on the exposition's boosterisms. Past the Spertus Museum of Judaica, which seeks to house in exposition-like comprehensiveness with Midway-esque verve the entirety of a culture, downward toward the exposition's original site in Jackson Park, where the city has reclaimed the old site and tourists return to Wooded Isle to look at the Japanese pavilion or drive past the regilded Statue of the Republic. Meanwhile, the rest of Chicago teems with the dangerous thrills of the Midway. On the west side, city and state have torn down and relocated the ethnic Midway-esque delights of Maxwell Street, building a mock neighborhood in its place. Further west, every day confirms for thousands, perhaps millions, the dark premises of urban failure that inspired reformers like Jane Addams and Jacob Riis to declaim the need for social as well as spatial reform in the modern city. The White City did not transform urbanism, nor did it magically reclaim the American experiment as a place of ideals made real, civilization brought westward and implanted permanently. But its influence is everywhere, in the structures of street layout and the placement of parks and monuments, in the dynamics of an urban life continually reinvented, and in the overall promise of a city as a place of spectacle, sometimes transformative, sometimes educational, sometimes simply entertaining, a continual panoply of sight and space. All right, guys, we finished the introduction. Thank you for sitting there with me. I know this beginning part is kind of boring because it doesn't have good pictures, but we are finally on chapter 1. Let me give you a sneak peek of some pictures. Look at that. Pavilion in the northeast corner of Jackson Park, 1888. So it looks like we still have a fair amount to read. We got the hat people, Burnham. All right, well, yeah, I guess this is another fair amount to read, but it is interesting. Look at this. This is where I went and checked the Instagram. This is still standing. And to me, you know, you go up to that and it doesn't look like it's made out of plaster. And this picture doesn't look like plaster. It looks exactly the same as it does here. Maybe a little more weathered, obviously not white. This is black and white. But it's monumental. And a photographer I was talking to in Chicago mentioned to me that this was actually the smallest building there, one of the smallest. Really amazing. Thanks for the comments. Thank you, Mick. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. So if this was the smallest one, and this is a monumental building, I could imagine how big the other ones are. But I'm excited to read more of this. As we get more into it, the pictures get better and deeper and more. Still a lot of writing, which is important. But look at these pictures. A lot of gems here. All right. So now we're on page 1. Made it to page 1. So thank you guys. Have a great day.